Okay, welcome to World Regional Geography. This will be Lecture 5 on Sub-Saharan Africa. In considering the physical landscape of the African continent, three major features should be focused on. First of all, of course, we have the deserts, the Sahara in the north, differentiating North Africa from Sub-Saharan Africa. We can also see the Kalahari and the Namib in the southern portion of the continent. But beyond the deserts, we also have the major Rift Valley in the east. And remember, Rifting Valley is when crustal plates are moving apart as opposed to coming together. And so in the Rift Valley, we see that the majority of the African continent will be moving to the west and north, and that the eastern rifting portion will then migrate eastward. So the Rift Valley is very active tectonically, a fair amount of earthquakes and volcanic activity. And then in addition to the Rifting Valley to the south, we have the Great Escarpment, and the escarpment is essentially the edge of the relatively stable African plate, and it wraps itself from essentially the end of the Rift Valley around the South African coast and then slightly up the West African side of the continent. And this Rift Valley, very important in connection with the Great Escarpment in that it produces some substantial and very active hydro features. That is, the rivers of Africa, as they drain towards the coast, experience some rather significant drops, and as a result have great potential for the generation of electricity, but also represent significant barriers to navigation. The biomes of sub-Saharan Africa are fairly straightforward. We can start along the equator and the western margin of the continent, and there you can see the equatorial rainforests starting in Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, and moving in towards the interior of the continent. Adjacent to the equatorial rainforests are the tropical savannas of sub-Saharan Africa. These are very important grasslands mixed with acacia scrub and what is known as Miamba woodland. To the margins on either side, again, of the tropical grasslands are the semi-desert regions, and in the north, the Sahelian zone. All of these areas have substantial amounts of grassland, but they are also areas of significant disease, which in many respects reduces their utility as agricultural land. The population map of sub-Saharan Africa reflects several important factors. First, there is the presence of the natural landscape strongly controlling human settlements. Rivers and favorable agricultural land attract the large rural population of the region. In addition, the presence of waterborne diseases, malaria, and sleeping sickness limits population across much of Central Africa and the savanna. Finally, in the last 2 centuries, the influence of European colonization and European economic efforts have increased populations in specific areas. For example, in the western portion of the continent, the highest populations occur in Nigeria and along the Atlantic coast. In the modern context of Nigeria, much of the population settlement is associated with economic activities of oil and oil extraction. Along the Atlantic coast, there has also been strong development over the last century of cash crops associated with plantations, including coconuts or copra, cacao, chocolate that is, and coffee and tea. In the east, high population densities can be seen in the rift valleys, especially along the shores of Lake Victoria, Lake Nyassa. In both of these cases, the settlements have been associated with ready access to high quality protein in terms of the fisheries, as well as favorable agricultural land. It is also should be noted that in Kenya and Tanzania, populations were also concentrated in association with urban developments and with the development of economies associated with coffee and tea plantations. The demographics of sub-Saharan Africa are in some respects fairly straightforward. If you look at the two pyramids that I have on this slide, you'll see that Zimbabwe in 2010 shows a fairly rapid population growth, that is a rather arrow-shaped population pyramid. If we look at it a little more closely, however, you'll see a couple of important points. First of all, that the inordinately large population and the lower age cohorts, and a very rapid drop-off in the intermediate and upper age cohorts. This in part indicates the relatively low life expectancy in sub-Saharan Africa, much of the continent having life expectancies of less than 60 years. In the upper population pyramid, it's also important to note the difference between the blue, the hypothetical population pyramid for Botswana in 2020, and the likely population pyramid in gold, which is the impact of HIV/AIDS. And as we move forward, we'll see that this impact, the declining population that would occur in the next decade, likely because of this infection, is very significant. In this map, I want to briefly highlight the impact of HIV throughout sub-Saharan Africa. If you'll notice the world population distribution in terms of infection, what you'll see very quickly is that Southern Africa has the highest rate of infection throughout the world. And in fact, the southern tier of countries have rates between 15 and in some cases as high as 34 to 35% infection rates. This is just a devastating impact on the population. You'll notice that this is infection rates between 15 and 45. And so this is infection within the most economically active and reproductively active portion of the population. So the AIDS epidemic in Africa represents a significant challenge. In addition, when we look at this rate of infection and we consider the cost of retroviral drugs, that is the drugs used to treat HIV/AIDS, we can see that many of the treatment plans used in the United States and Europe often cost 2 to 3 times the average annual income of the population. In this slide, we can see the overall impact of both HIV/AIDS and of other social and environmental factors on life expectancy. Sub-Saharan Africa sticks out on virtually every measure, every study that's been done on life expectancy. And we can see that throughout the region, life expectancies are often well below 60 years and in some cases below 45 years. In a similar manner, the total fertility rates in sub-Saharan Africa, you can see, are showing the effects of economic and political instability, as well as, again, the HIV/AIDS virus. Here in the southern cone of sub-Saharan Africa, total fertility rates have dropped off rather dramatically. In part, this is due to high mortality rates in women during the reproductive years. You can see in the West African countries, reproductive rates, high fertility rates are seen throughout West Africa and to some degree up into the Horn region. Throughout Africa, these rates of fertility have remained fairly dynamic over the last 3 decades. When we put all of this together and examine total population growth within sub-Saharan Africa, a couple of things are present. First of all, we can see that low growth rates are becoming prevalent in the areas most affected by HIV/AIDS, that is in South Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe, etc. We can also see that in the mid-states to the east, the Anglophone states, excuse me, that the annual population growth rates are somewhat moderate. However, in West Africa and in Central Africa, we see that rates of population growth in excess of 3% are still present and are significantly problematic in these areas with very, very low economic growth and low quality or human development index values. The modern cultural, economic, and social landscape of sub-Saharan Africa can in large part be traced to its colonial past. Prior to the 1800s, very little of sub-Saharan Africa was known to Europeans in general, although certainly exploration had been done. But beginning in the early part of the 1800s, Europeans began to explore, and by the 1850s, a substantial number of outposts and coastal settlements had begun to influence the economies of Europe and the recognition of potential colonial and extractive settlements. As a result, by 1884, the European powers came together in the Berlin Congress to divide up the colonial landscape and to prevent any further conflicts. As a result, substantial German, British, Portuguese, and Italian settlements, French, excuse me, got to add that one in, were identified within the continent. As you can see in this slide, it is a lithograph from that period, and unfortunately what you also see is that there's very little of Africa known to the individuals that were making the decisions. What you can see in this slide is the results of the Berlin Congress or Conference. What is most important to see is that the majority of Africa essentially became either Francophone, that is West Africa, or Anglophone, largely East Africa. Of course, there were some other notable exceptions, the Belgian Congo, for example, and the German holdings in Tanganyika. However, much of this eventually evolved through the series of the First and Second World War into, again, a largely Francophone and largely Anglophone division on the continent. In North Africa, certainly there were some differences in terms of the influences of Italy and the influences of other minor powers. An important thing to identify in the Murdoch ethnic map, which was constructed in 1959, is that ethnic, or in the old term, tribal boundaries, by no means coincide with the boundaries that resulted from the colonial imposition in sub-Saharan Africa. As a result, you have many ethnic groups that straddle boundaries or multiple ethnic groups within a single boundary. In both cases, this has led to conflict and forces that, in a sense, pull modern states apart. One aspect of the modern cultural landscape in sub-Saharan Africa is that of language. And in this slide, I want to contrast two things fairly quickly. One is that of vernacular languages, or what we might call indigenous languages that are spoken in the home, and the other is the business languages, often in this case, European languages. A wide landscape of Kiswahili and Bantu languages across most of Central Africa in the vernacular sense, and then of course in the business sense we have the Francophone Africa in blue and the Anglophone Africa in red here, more or less dividing the continent with some other things on top of those characteristics. Finally, in the cultural landscape of sub-Saharan Africa, we can see that the regional boundary coincides largely with the boundary in the continent between Islamic religious traditions in the north and Christian and indigenous religions in the south. It is true that throughout Africa, indigenous animistic religions are still very important and in fact form a syncretic amalgamation in many other regions. This concludes the section on sub-Saharan Africa. In the next section we will move into North Africa and Southwest Asia and examine the cultural and social components of Islam in the region.